Good evening and welcome. I am Terry Kay of the Jewish Grandparents Network. Thank you for joining us tonight for navigating the emotional roller coaster of long distance grandparenting. We so appreciate that you made the time to join us. First, may I start with a big thank you to Sarah Reed, our JGN colleague, who is helping facilitate. Sarah has put in chat how you can turn on captions for those who wish to use that feature. Uh, just a note that we are recording tonight's session as we always do. However, because this is a personal and a sensitive topic, we will edit the recording so that we show only the presenter, Dr. Kerry Byrne, sharing her guidance, and there will be no identifying information about you all, our participants. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome back Kerry Byrne. Kerry is the founder of the Long Distance Grandparent, a mission-driven organization dedicated to helping grandparents build strong bonds with their grandchildren across the miles. Kerry has over 20 years of experience in aging and care across a variety of sectors and combines her professional expertise with her personal insights as a mother of two, whose own children have grandparents living at a distance. Kerry's work emphasizes practical, meaningful strategies to foster intergenerational connections, reflecting her belief that children need their grandparents now more than ever, regardless of distance. I think you'll be interested you'll hear during Kerry's presentation that she's the author of the recently released Coping with the Grief of Grandparenting from a Distance, and we will put that link into chat through the course of the evening. So may I turn it over to you, Kerry, with all our many thanks.
Thank you so much, Terry, and to the Jewish Grandparents Network. Last time I was here, and I think it was back maybe in December, we were talking about the ways that you can stay connected to your grandchildren from a distance. And I had funny glasses. I was giving demonstrations about how you could play with your grandchildren. And during that presentation, I said something. I said, okay, I just want to take a second and acknowledge that it's not all sunshine and rainbows, this long distance grandparenting thing. And the chat box kind of blew up. And I wasn't surprised by it because when I start talking about long distance grandparenting, and I've been doing this for several years now, what comes to the surface pretty quickly is that there are a lot of emotions involved, and not all great ones. We'll talk about some of those today, but they're certainly complex. And so while I get my slides onto the screen here, where we're going to talk about the emotional roller coaster of grandparenting from a distance, what I'd love for you all to do is just to pop in the chat what emotions have surprised you the most about being a long distance grandparent. And so just go into the chat and let me know what are some of the emotions that have surprised you or that are just coming up, bubbling up to the surface for you right now. I'm going to just start reading some of them, but don't stop putting them in. So they're going kind of quickly. So we have anger, longing, missing out on the daily details of my grandchild's life, bittersweet, sadness about missing out, resentment, longing, fear my grandchildren will not have many memories of me, sadness, longing, and frustration. Sadness that son-in-law isn't Jewish. It hadn't bothered me before. He's a great guy. Longing, frustration, sadness, jealousy of the other grandparents. I've heard all of these things in various forms from long distance grandparents. You know, whether to move to them or not, that's a big consideration that a lot of long distance grandparents are making. Missing them so much, wishing I was there, disappointment, profound sadness, missing that direct interaction, frustration with the parents who don't let me know of major happenings in her life, not being involved in more of the day-to-day happiness, frustration, I'm currently not a long distance grandparent, but probably will be. Having so little choice about when I can see them, fear, sadness, heartbreak, so much joy seeing pictures of my baby grandson, depression for a day after a short 2 hour visit, wanting to be a fly on the wall. These are really beautiful descriptions, and we can see from the chat that there is certainly a range of emotions that people experience as a long distance grandparent. And what we're going to talk about today, first of all, is the complexity of these emotions, how other long distance grandparents feel, so that if anybody pops something into the chat and thought, oh, I don't know if I want to put that in there, you will see that there are other grandparents that are expressing feeling this way for sure. I want to talk to you about what's a term that I have coined called long distance grandparent grief, LDG grief for short, and some of the key features of it. Want us to focus on how we can move from what we can't do to what can be possible. I'm going to share with you what I like to call a menu of coping concepts and strategies. And then we're going to have a pretty robust question and answer period as well. So, how about this for a menacing slide? Caution, hazard. But the reason that I have it up here is because when we're talking about this level of emotion, it can be really tough. It can bring out other emotions that you think, oh yeah, I actually feel that way too. And I guess the kind of, current language is it can feel sort of triggering. What I want you to know is that you're in a really safe space here with all of us. You will see nodding heads in the group if you kind of scroll through the faces that are on video. And I also want you to know that I have spent hundreds of hours with long distance grandparents in Zoom rooms just like this, where they introduce themselves. I have a membership for long distance grandparents, and they'll start talking about their situation quite joyfully in the beginning, and then they burst into tears. And then they look around and see, other people tearing up, lots of nodding heads. This might be the first time that you are in a room, a virtual room, with a number of people who really deeply understand what you're feeling and what you're experiencing that other people may not understand, and frankly may have dismissed up until this point. And so I want to highlight that for you because what I also want you to do is to think about perhaps talking with, I see some people are here, husbands and wives, like having a bit of a debriefing conversation after this webinar with one another or with a trusted friend or whoever else you go to for counsel, because it can bring up a lot of emotions. And I don't want to leave you hanging after this, without that feeling. If you have something that you just need to get off your chest, email me. I have received hundreds of emails from long distance grandparents sharing the frustration, the resentment, and various emotions that they experience as long distance grandparents. And so you can't shock me because I will have heard it certainly before, I suspect. So let's talk about the complexity of emotions. And one of the reasons that being a long distance grandparent is so complex is because becoming a grandparent is really pitched as like this very joyful experience. And it is, and it can be for many of you. It also feels, quite negative in some of the emotions that you experience because you feel like potentially abandoned, a longing, resentment, irritation with the parents, all of the things that, came up in the chat. And I describe these as comfortable and uncomfortable emotions. We could call them positive and negative emotions. Recognizing that negative emotions are okay because that's really just our way of being able to say, hey, we don't like this, and it's okay to feel that way. This is a list of emotions that I have collected over the years from long distance grandparents about how it feels to be a long distance grandparent. And you'll see that there's a lot of joy, love, hope, resilience, curiosity, excitement. And also, at the same time, resentment, disappointment, worry, irritation, ambivalence, confusion, powerlessness, and inadequacy. I've had grandparents say to me they feel like they're failing as a grandparent because they can't be the grandparent that they wanted to be. And, I'm going to just share with you. Actually, sorry, hang on one second. I'm just going to go back for a second because you're probably not going to answer this question right now. But if you do have a pen and paper, And think about the question that we started with. It's a really powerful exercise, and I have walked grandparents through this exercise before. What emotions are coming up for me about my grandparenting situation? Because sometimes it will surprise you how you're actually feeling about it and what is at the core of how you're feeling about it. You'll receive a copy of these slides and a discussion guide after the presentation. I think tomorrow or soon thereafter. Terry's nodding. And so you can have a look at that and just go through these emotions. You can even circle ones that you might be feeling. This is like a very typical email that I receive in my inbox at the long distance grandparent. I share this one because this is from a grandparent who's a therapist, and she's not the only therapist that I've heard from over the years. And she says, I think my biggest challenge remains the sadness and grief that has occurred since they moved away. Not only do I miss my grandchildren and the future I thought I had with them, but I also intensely miss my son and daughter. Right or wrong, at times I feel angry and have some abandonment issues. I'm a therapist by training. I understand all of this clinically, but privately it is so difficult. And so this, she wrote to me after I wrote my first blog in the area of long distance grandparenting and grief. But when I tell you that I've received hundreds of these emails, like let's have a look at this because I'm on Instagram, so you can go follow me there if you would like. I share ideas and inspirations, tips for staying connected, and I address some of the relationship issues that people are facing. But I posted this. I don't have a huge account. I think I have, 7,000 followers, let's say on Instagram. And I posted this. Long distance grandparenting is a bittersweet dance between love and longing, cherishing what we have while grieving what we're missing. And if you want to see that you're not the only person feeling the way that you're feeling, go and have a look at this post on my Instagram feed. There are, almost 500 comments on this post, over 10,000 people. Like I said, I don't even have 10,000 followers. 10,000 people expressing various things. I just went back and looked at a few because I couldn't keep up with all of them. But this one grandmother, my daughter, her husband, and my precious grandson moved 1,100 miles away a year ago. I haven't been the same since. I feel empty, worthless, sad, and hopeless. No one talks about this kind of pain. It's hard to put into words how your heart and your empty arms ache. I live in Australia, and three of my grandsons live in Norway. I miss them terribly. And so you'll see some common themes here. And the reason that I now refer to it as grief, and so you might not be thinking, it's not grief, like I am resentful, I'm angry, whatever it is that you're feeling. But in my work with grandparents, what I see is that when we kind of trace it back, start to interrogate it a little bit, where's this coming from? It's based on loss of time, moments together, knowledge about your grandchild, them having knowledge about you. It's incredibly painful. I have a friend who's an expert in grief, and during the pandemic, she said to me, that sounds an awful lot like grief, what you're describing. So how long ago was that? How far past that horrible time are we now? I was, several years ago, and it took me a while just to start to figure out what was going on. And so researcher, and so I went into the research and started to look at grief research. How can we help explain and understand what's going on? Because I think until we understand what's going on, it's very difficult to then think about, okay, what do we do next? And we will get there in this presentation. We will talk about some of the things that you can do to start to cope with the way that you're feeling. One of the theories that is at the forefront of this type of grief is called ambiguous loss. And it was put forward by a grief expert called Dr. Pauline Boss, and she actually used it to describe what families were experiencing when military families were experiencing when they had someone who was missing in action. It's since been applied to dementia. And Helen Ellis, who wrote a great book about grandparenting from a distance, specifically for those who have grandchildren and the adult kids in a different country, she really focuses on expats. But she talked about ambiguous loss because what's happening is that it's the type of loss where no one died, no one died, uh, but your grandchild is not physically present. So they are emotionally, psychologically present for you, but they are physically absent. And the ambiguity in that causes this feeling of grief. It's that uncertainty, like what's happening, what's going on in their lives. I don't know if I know them. I don't know if they know me, right? So the ambiguity and the uncertainty is really at the root of the loss feeling. Secondly, I looked at anticipatory grief. Somebody mentioned earlier in the presentation that they're not a grandparent yet, but they think they're going to be. Well, some of the toughest cases of long distance grandparent grief that I have worked with are those that are going from being local grandparents to long distance grandparents. It's an incredibly painful time when they move away. You've known the kind of sweet life of having your grandchildren close to you, and then they move away. Anticipatory grief is really what it sounds like, right? You're anticipating like the worry, you're not going to know what's going on, you're not going to know them, you're not going to have the relationship. The third type of grief, and I mention these because they're all talked about at length in the grief research, disenfranchised grief. This is the kind of grief that is not acknowledged by society. So it's like, why are you grieving about that? And perhaps you have felt that way. Perhaps people have said, well, at least you have grandchildren. At least you get to have grandchildren, or at least you get to go to Hawaii. Isn't that great? Or wherever it might be. And in your mind, you're thinking it's actually not that great. I have been to Hawaii 15 times. I've seen it enough. I would really just rather they lived around the corner. And so, what I found after going through the grief research and some of the concepts is that they're useful in helping to understand what's going on for long distance grandparents, but they don't capture all of it. And so I decided to just come up with my own definition of long distance grandparent grief that I feel encompasses most of what I've heard from long distance grandparents, not just in this one slide. We'll talk about some of the key features in just a second. But this is the definition: a complex emotional experience characterized by a deep longing, excuse me, for proximity and connection. It's not about the finality of loss through death, but about the persistent ache of missing everyday moments, milestones, and the intimacy of in-person interactions that often define close family relationships. The kicker for this one is that the grief coexists with this already massive challenge that you have of nurturing meaningful relationships despite being at a distance. And so while geographic distance is at the root, there is really so much more to it. And I want to talk about some of these things, some of the features, and see if you see yourself in here. We've already talked about kind of the ongoing and ambiguous nature of it, the ambiguity, the uncertainty. Like these things really play into how you're feeling about it. There's also emotional ambivalence. And what this is if you picture that slide where I had the comfortable emotions and the uncomfortable emotions, it's when you start to feel both of those in the same moment, emotional ambivalence. So you get off you're on a video chat, they are like talking so cute and they've told you have this great chat. Maybe it's been a tornado and you've just seen up their nose for 5 minutes, but it's still joyful because you've had that time together. And then this big kind of grief and sadness, like that's, being like a screen time granny. That's what I get. And so there's an ambivalence to it. As humans, we like to know we either feel A or we feel B. But for long distance grandparents, you are naturally feeling the joy of being a grandparent alongside this deep sadness and longing. The second piece, and I did allude to this already, is the feeling that it's really invisible grief and it's dismissed by friends, sometimes by partners who are kind of saying to you, like, okay, this is our life, like, get over it. You got to move on. And that is not, it's not as simple as that. And I have to tell you that in the lead up to this presentation, I just took a little look online to see if anybody else is writing about this yet, talking about this. And there was this psychologist from Psychology Today. And I thought, oh, great. Like Psychology Today is a very well-known website. They're actually going to address this. And he had the title of one of the blogs that I had written, which was, I think, something like How to Cope with the Grief and Sadness of Grandparenting from Afar, as the kind of headline of his blog. And then he said, like, I think that this is basically like not a good thing to be promoting. I didn't, he was saying like, we have to be optimistic about this. You have to look at the possibilities. And then of course he said, you know, he leaned on a theory of optimism and said, just FaceTime them or just do this. And I thought, oh, okay. So, anyways, I'm probably going to follow up and write to that psychologist because he's dismissing it. I don't know how we get to dealing with how long distance grandparents are feeling if we can't put it out in the open and say, this is grief, it's sadness, it's painful, and I will probably need some help to get through this in some way because it's a deep emotional response to something that is very upsetting. So invisible and dismissed, and you may hear this from your friends as well, that they just sometimes this happens when your friend complains to you about having to like look after the grandchildren twice a week, and you think, oh, I would love to do that. A lot of people reach out and share how their friends will say things that are a little bit hurtful. Of course, it's not the friend's intention to say that, but that's kind of where it lands. The intensity and fluctuating nature of it, and this catches people off guard. And so you can think, okay, I've got this, we're into a routine, we're FaceTiming every week or every month or whatever it might be. And then you kind of get this grief surge of like, oh, this is what it's going to be like. This is what it's going to be like. And it fluctuates. It happens a lot around in-person visits. In the grief literature, they talk about grief surges that can happen when you lose someone. It's very similar in long distance grandparenting, right after an in-person visit, because that loss has happened. You've had it all. You've been with them, you've had them in your lap, or if you've got teenage grandchildren, you've been like driving them to practices and having the chats and being part of the family, and then it's ripped away. There's a loss there. It's grief. And so the intensity of it can ebb and flow. You can feel really okay some days, and then other days just really sad. And when it comes to that, I just want you to know that it's really natural. That's natural, to have that kind of up and down feeling. The other piece of this is that it's a redefined role, and I can't stress how important this is. So I'm going to stop for a second because if you're surfing on your phone, then come back to me. Or if you want to write something down, come back to me because it's this, what happens is that you have this vision of how you were going to be a grandparent, right? And sometimes it's based on how your own parents got to be a grandparent. And so it's this vision of what you think grandparenting is going to look like. And now you have this other thing that's happening, which is your grandparenting experience. But there is a need to redefine your role as a grandparent, right? To re-envision and to reconcile like what you thought it was going to be with what it is and what's possible. And the hardest thing for long distance grandparents sometimes is that they get stuck in the place of, but I want it to look another way. I want them to move back. I want, I want it to look another way. And it's not going to. And so sometimes if you get stuck there, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes, it actually can prevent you from moving into a place of, how can I be in the relationship that I have? How can I make the absolute best of the relationship that I get to have with my grandchildren? The context driven and complexity piece makes me think of my psychologist friend at Psychology Today, because he was saying in his article, like we just go visit them and it's great and it's all these things. Like not everybody can do that. Either financially you can't go because you have to fly to a different country because you are getting either older yourself or caregiving for a parent. So you can't leave. You can't go visit in the way that you want. Grandparenting also coincides with things like retirement, things like mobility issues, health issues, things happening with your own friends. There are a lot of things that can play into this that can really kind of, I shouldn't really have these overlapping in some ways because you can feel a little dismissed when someone says, oh, well, just go visit them. And that's not possible for everybody to just go visit them. Okay, so I want to just bring that piece together for you because those are the key features. And this again is just an email that I received over the years. I keep track of these. And this person talks about her four daughters who were so close, and see if you can see some of the key features in here. My daughters were so close to their grandparents growing up who lived in the same town. I worked very hard for them to be very connected to them, and I just assumed someday the roles would reverse. Three of mine moved away. It ripped my heart out. Last year, we traveled 9 trips to be connected to the grands. I am worn out from back and forth travel. Once the grands are older and busy, I fear becoming an afterthought. And so we see in, a lot of these emails that I receive, it's multiple things going on for grandparents. And so, yeah, yes, it is tough to deal with. I'm going to stop here just for a second because I haven't really looked at the comments. Hi, everybody. I can sort of see more faces now. But I want to see, Terry, is there anything that we want to address because the next
There's a
section.
lot here.
Okay,
Go
so
ahead.
all right, I was going to say I usually kind of keep an eye on it, but I really got into it there. So the next section we're going to talk about this menu of coping strategies, and some things that have helped other grandparents that I have worked with. I don't have a magic pill up my sleeve right now. To give you this is a process, and perhaps, like I said, for a lot of you, the first time that you're going to be acknowledging, like, yes, this is actually grief that I'm feeling. So Terry, where do we want to go into some of the
Yeah,
questions or
yeah,
comments?
because I would love that. There are a couple of questions about you said I see some of you with a partner or a spouse like lean on each other, and there are a couple of questions about what do you do. A few people said I've lost my husband passed away, or my mom that I relied on died, and somebody said I'm slowly unraveling inside. So when somebody very close to you dies that you needed yourself, you relied on, how does that impact your emotions when your grandchildren are far away?
Well, of course, it's another layer, isn't it? Because, you have all the things that we just talked about, which is a lot. And you're also coping with a deep grief from losing someone who's died. And so, not having that person that your go-to person, makes it even more difficult. And I think that you know, there are like a range of, and I'm not just saying this just as a cop out. Like sometimes people need to seek out a therapist in these situations if it's possible, because grandparents that I work with who are in my membership, several of them do reach out for therapy. And so you're going to want to look for a therapist who has experience in grief, who has experience with the multitude of things that happen as we get older. And that can be parents dying, friends dying, partners dying. And so having a therapist just to kind of like talk it through, it's not, you're not in for lifelong therapy here. Sometimes a couple sessions, just kind of getting it out and being able to talk through it can really help. But what I want to say is that, I'm so sorry that you are in this situation where you have either lost the person that you could talk to about this or lost the person that you were grandparenting with, because there can be a lot of support in that.
Thank you, Kerry. This is a statement, a comment rather than a question, but there's a question implied. Our friend says it starts to feel as though they no longer want you in their lives as much too.
Yes. Um, so one of the probably most popular things I've ever posted on Instagram, and I use it just as a little bit of a uh, kind of like I like to stay on top of social media because parents are on there, right? I'm a parent, but I'm not a millennial parent. And so I like to stay in tune with what's going on. And one of the most popular things that I wrote, it was after my own father died. And it was, dear grandparents from the parents. And it was this, real acknowledgement that at this particular period of life, they're in the thick of it, and that what people on Instagram accuse you of having is called gramnesia. Okay, so it's a term that I really dislike, but it's this term that's like you don't remember what it's like to be a parent. And I think that there's probably some truth to that because, my youngest is 7. I have friends, just because of the circles that I hang out with, who have toddlers, who have small children, or even some that have teenagers where it's like a full-time driving around type of job. And, the busyness of life today is really tough. And the other piece that I think, and so, okay, first of all, let me start by saying, yeah, it hurts to feel that way. And you're not alone in feeling that. Like you'll see in the comments, I'm sure other people said some version of that. And I absolutely hear from that. There's a huge amount of disappointment that can come when the parents don't engage in the connection, when your grandchildren, are not seeming to engage in the connection. For some of you who have tweens or teens, But right now, and parents are experiencing what I call digital overwhelm. And if you want to read a little bit more about this, have a look at a blog that I wrote, and it's called Bite Your Tongue with Love. Because I don't think that we necessarily need to bite our tongue in communicating with family. But what I was trying to say is that, I was trying to explain, and I've explained this to members of my own membership before, is that my phone is just like an explosion all the time. I have it on silence right now. But I have like two different apps and this is not an excuse. This is just a reason and potentially something just to think about. So my children play soccer. They're in one sport. I have an app for each of them. I have a carpool WhatsApp group for each of them. I get emails from the school. We get emails from like the planning committee of the school. When I was growing up, I just went and played soccer. Like I just went to soccer. It wasn't all the things that had to happen and the tournaments and the complications and who's going with who and what's happening. So there's a lot of digital communication that's happening. And so you can actually get buried in like sometimes family, and I'm guilty of this, and I care deeply about this relationship. But family will reach out, hey, show the boys this. And it gets layered on top of like, so and so's getting a birthday. Like, you don't get birthday invitations anymore. You get a screenshot of the birthday card. So you have to keep track of that in your phone from a number that you've never seen that someone else, like a parent, gave to another parent to give to you. So I suppose what I'm saying is that there is, parents are asking you, I think, right now to take on a little more of the emotional weight of the relationship. And sometimes that can, really feel like that you're forgotten in it. But what I argue in this letter that I wrote is that you're not forgotten. They are taking you for granted potentially because they know that your love is there. They know that you're the ones that love them unconditionally. And so, sometimes that means that you're the one that's going to hear from them last. I know that's not very satisfying, but I think that that's the truth.
There are many more questions. Would you like to continue and then we'll come back to the questions? Or do you want to take one more? What's your choice?
I'll take one more. Let's take one more and I'll be more
Okay.
succinct in my answer. And move on.
Um, how this is rather curious. Just wondering, are these feelings mostly from the grandmas? Just a quick look at the attendees. There seem to be more women than men, more grandmas than grandpas. Is this representative of the findings, or are these feelings equal?
So I haven't done, a survey or any kind of research. I've just been taking research that's out there and applying it. But what I see, is that yes, it's predominantly grandmothers who reach out to me, but that doesn't mean that I haven't heard from a lot of grandparents or grandpas as well. So I definitely hear from grandfathers who are struggling with this as well. So I think yes to it's the grandmothers reaching out, and sharing their stories, asking for help. But maybe, if I looked at my inbox, maybe 5% are from grandpas. Okay. We have more questions, but I am going to go back into talking about some of the ways that you can start to begin to process these feelings. And the reason that I'm sharing the ones that I'm sharing today are because they're ones that have helped other long distance grandparents. They're ones that, I have worked with in groups of long distance grandparents, and these are the things that have worked for them. And so I wanted to share them with all of you. The idea here is to learn to cope with the grief and the sadness, the resentment, whatever it is that you're feeling. It can't be fixed, right? Grief can't be fixed. It's something that walks alongside you. In fact, there's a grief expert called Francis Weller, and he talks about grief as a companion. For anyone who's lost anyone, this will resonate, but it applies to long distance grandparenting as well, because we're looking at kind of like two paths moving along where you are coping with this grief is your companion as a long distance grandparent. And then on the other side of this is you are working to connect with your grandchildren from a distance and do all the things that I talked about in the last presentation. So this one really resonates for grandparents, and this is a theory of grief that was, put forward in the 1990s, and it talks about growing around your grief because we often talk about grief as in it gets smaller, right? That it gets smaller over time somehow. But what this person said is actually grief stays the same in size, but you grow around that grief. And grandparents definitely see this happening and what grows around it. So the kind of connection actions that they take, right? So when you come to a place of, as an example, being able to write or send a monthly mail package to your grandchildren and knowing that they receive it, knowing that there's excitement in receiving that, then it starts to just kind of insulate that grief just a tiny bit. And so, it might be that you choose to, I have lots of grandparents who have decided that they're going to volunteer in their local communities with an age group that's similar to their grandchildren. So they go into the school or they go wherever it is and they volunteer with kids that are similar in age to their grandchild because they can learn about what is an 8-year-old like right now, and how to talk to them. And then they also are able to, do something good for their community. And so there are all kinds of things that can happen that allow you to grow around this grief. But it's been really useful. I will leave it there because it does require just sitting with it and thinking about it, and what that might look like for you. This next one is also really useful way of thinking. And if we have any therapists on the call, this both and thinking will be very familiar to you. It's rooted in dialectical thinking, right? So it's this idea that you can have contradictions. We talked about emotional ambivalence. Now, both and thinking is the ability to hold these two thoughts at the same time. So, for example, I will never be the grandparent I imagined. And if you stopped there, then I will never be the grandparent I imagined. It's going into your brain. That's kind of feeding the neural pathways, versus both and thinking, which is I will never be the grandparent I imagined, and I'm still capable of figuring out how to have a meaningful relationship with them. And this takes a lot of practice to do it, but I have found that it is really helpful for long distance grandparents who do this. Let me give you just hold on 1 second, a couple of more examples. Um, the distance makes me feel connected from my grandkids, and I can still have a deep and special connection in my own way. I'm afraid they'll forget about me or grow distant, and I can still nurture our bond through intentional efforts. And so it's this idea that you hold both of these thoughts at the same time. And they're quite opposing, right? Like, I'll never be the grandparent I imagined. Um, and I'm still capable of figuring out how to have a meaningful relationship with them. We are just scratching the surface here. I just want you to know this goes a little bit deeper, but I just want to give you some tools and some things to think about when it comes to coping with this. Now, reflective practices, and I have to tell you, I always thought that like journaling and affirmations was a little bit woo. But I've looked into the research about it. It's quite good. And I've also watched long distance grandparents use journaling. And so here's an example. I talk to long distance grandparents about, after you have a visit, journaling, writing down all the things that you're feeling, all the emotions that you're having. And then when you go to the next visit, I just have a read through that, because then you'll kind of know. It won't be such a shock when you get back the second time, because you'll know how you're feeling. And then that allows you to have a plan in place. I always encourage grandparents after a visit to make sure that you have something in place, for yourself. And that can look in a variety of ways. It can be, like maybe it's a hike with a friend, a coffee with a friend. It depends on what that looks like for you. But maybe it's theater. I have a grandparent where they always go out to the theater the night after their grandchild leaves because that's something that just helps to distract them from how they're feeling after that visit. But journaling through, you'll see what this person sent in. I can start writing about how frustrated I feel, but then that can lead into that intentionality and trying to keep being positive. And when I say keep being positive, I don't mean it in that kind of Pollyannish kind of way, but an intentional kind of way. And then this is an affirmation card from an actual long distance grandparent, who at first probably didn't think that affirmations were something that they were going to use. But they printed out, what I gave them. And, found a lot of solace in this. And affirmations are most effective when repeated daily and when you personalize them to resonate with your individual experience. So I encourage you to write your own, but you'll see for this one, I am strong and resilient, and I have overcome challenges before. I will find ways to be the best grandparent I can be from a distance. And so, walking into an in-person visit with some of these affirmations, I've seen some of the comments where it's like, you don't love your daughter-in-law. And, before you go to a visit, write yourself an affirmation that is like, this is the person who my son chose. I'm going to be respectful. I'm going to find out something about them, right? Setting a bit of an intention before you go to that visit can really help with some of these kind of like emotional relationship type pieces that you're experiencing. And this is so key. And I'm sharing this because this was said by someone named Dr. Carla Dahl. And she actually worked with Dr. Pauline Boss, who I mentioned was who produced and has studied and written books about ambiguous loss. Dr. Carla Dahl came and spoke to my membership, and she's a long distance grandmother and a grief expert. And she talked about her kind of one of her kind of main things that she said is that we need to learn to cope with hope, which in the moment sounded a little bit cheesy, but she's not trying to be cheesy. She's saying, how might you imagine something new? I'm not talking about pretending or like trying to be optimistic when you don't feel optimistic. I'm not talking about happy talking yourself. I'm talking about thinking of, can you hold this paradox that your grandchild is both with you and not with you? They're physically absent, psychologically present. How do you figure out how to live into a relationship that is at a distance? And so, closing this, and this is where the reconciling piece comes in. So, you thought it was going to look like this. It does not look like this. It looks like something very different. And so, how can you reconcile those two so that you don't get stuck in the grief and the sadness of how you're feeling about it? Because it can look like this. So Terry mentioned that I am a mom to two little ones, and we have long distance grandparents. And there will be some pictures here where you'll think, I don't really want it to look like that because that's just FaceTime, and I don't love FaceTime with kids. I really much prefer the in-person moments, but it can look like this when there is intentionality in the relationship. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is something that I call our grand moments. If you, maybe in the workplace, you've been advised to have like a smile file or a success file at some stage. When you're feeling down at work, like look at what some clients have said about you. There's like a whole thing about having a smile file. I call it our grand moments because what you're doing is you're writing down moments that you've shared together. And this really is rooted in memory work and reminiscence therapy. And when you revisit and reflect on positive memories, that can be a really helpful way to help you cope with some of this. And so, start a journal with some of the moments that you've shared. I have grandparents that have done this, for years now. And it's very powerful to be able to go back and look at some of these moments shared to say, we do have a relationship. It's not the one that I want. It's not the one that the local grandparents get to have, but it is the one that I have, and I am doing a great job in staying connected. And so, in relation to that, perhaps one of the most powerful things that you can do is intentional connection. And I've shared a few examples here because these are grandparents who, I look at these pictures and I see people because I know the grandparent who on the left-hand side received this letter from her 3-year-old granddaughter after sending lots of mail to her granddaughter. And then her granddaughter said, I want to write Nana back. And so she shared this letter with all of us. In the middle, this is a grandmother who has she's got tons of grandchildren, but she makes these envelopes stand out. Like this is Nana mail. There's stickers. There's like, not sending a plain white envelope with an address. You want to put some things on it. This is mail that's fun to receive, whether you are 20 or 2. And then finally, this grandmother who I've blanked out her face because she's got funny glasses on. She bought this new little monkey that hangs around her neck. She also writes to her grandchildren often. All of these grandparents have experienced some level of grief sadness, resentment, feeling frustrated with the parents, some of them feeling frustrated with an in-law, right? Daughter-in-law or son-in-law. And they have found ways to be able to cope with their own feelings so that they can show up in the best way possible as a long distance grandparent. And that's what I want for all of you. Is to be, we're not going to solve the grief, sadness, resentment, anything that you're feeling here tonight. I hope that I provided enough strategies for you to draw on so that you can come to a place of what can this relationship look like and what are the things that I can do, so that we can start to focus on the things that you can do as opposed to the things that you can't do. A final slide here because I did say I would talk about this, but I want to tell you I've written a whole blog about this that you're going to receive a link to with the follow-up notes. And this is helping your grandchildren with their emotions because you may notice that when you're saying goodbye to your grandchildren, that they are acting out. Some people share with me that their grandchildren get quite upset with them when they're leaving. And I've highlighted in this blog just, what's going on in various age groups and some of the things that you can do, like goodbye rituals that you can have with your grandchildren. I'm going to stop there. Oh, actually, hang on one more second. So this is the guide that Terry was talking about. I released this a few months ago. It goes in depth into the things that we've talked about. I share case studies about other grandparents who are experiencing the things that you have all shared here in the chat box today. And I go into a lot more detail around numerous other strategies that you can use for coping with the grief. Okay, I'm bang on 7:46. So
You too much.
I
My
know it's a,
yeah.
I know it's a lot. I know it's a lot to take in, a lot of information and a lot of emotions. And so, like I said, my hope is that this will be the first step for you in trying to, recognize some of these feelings and get to a place of coping with them so that we can move to walk alongside, right? Coping and connection.
Kerry, thank you. I want to just remind everyone that we will send you all this information tomorrow. We're not finished, so don't go anywhere. But I feel I need to say it. You look for the email. If it's not in your inbox, it'll be in your spam. It'll be there by the end of the day tomorrow, and we'll include the recording that will be edited to show no participants' names or faces, and we'll have all the links that Kerry has spoken about. Uh, I think in a minute we can invite you, our friends, to raise your Zoom hand and to unmute yourself. But I do want to just ask Kerry, there have been a number of questions. I wonder if you could speak to this. When you're going to visit with your grandchildren, sort of the hope is it's going to be all sweetness and roses and sunflowers and joy and hugs and so on. And there are often issues, and people have listed some of them. For example, I feel I have to walk on eggshells with my son and his wife. It's very stressful because they are in a mixed heritage, a multi-faith family. We heard in advance from a grandparent who said that it's a big issue that they have different political views, the grandparents, vastly different political views than the adult children, and it causes friction when they go. So could you speak to some of these issues, how to how to have realistic expectations?
Yes. Okay. So if I had the answer to the political differences, I'm in Canada, and so I'll premise it with that. But I've heard from increasingly more grandparents over the last few months about some of the differences that they're experiencing, and so it you know that's definitely a tough one. And if you are I'm about to write a blog actually about walking on eggshells, because I hear this from so many grandparents that they feel like they're walking on eggshells, and this can be in relationships that are actually quite healthy, where there is no major difference that anybody can see, but they still feel like their daughter-in-law goes to bed early and doesn't talk to them, or their son-in-law kind of makes comments about things that they do. And so I'm going to write a blog about it, because it's very difficult to answer in probably a 1 minute conversation. But I think that, you know, if you can get to a place of leading with curiosity and just taking it in as information, why might this be, right? Like, why is there this level of walking on eggshells? And I have to tell you what I see a lot when I'll do one-on-one consultation sometimes with grandparents, and when we dig deep, Oftentimes, it is something that happened when there was a baby involved and a new mom, that there was a boundary crossed, that there was something said that we can trace it right back. And so I think being, if you feel like you're walking on eggshells, if you feel like there's tension and you have a strong enough relationship to bring it up with your own child, first have a conversation about it. I'm sensing that, like whatever that might be, you have to come up with your own words because I want it to sound authentic and from you. Or you choose to kind of walk on eggshells, right? So you have you have a conversation about something. You can choose to avoid it when it comes to the political discussion. Like it's so sensitive. If you can move to more of a focus on shared values, like love, respect the grandchildren and family, stay there and keep the conversations there. Much better than falling into some kind of political confrontation. That's all I've got for that one, Terry. Sorry.
Please feel free to raise your Zoom hand and to unmute, and we will spotlight you. And in the interim, Kerry, there are a couple of questions about the virtues of and not of FaceTime. Somebody wrote, if one more person says, well, at least you have FaceTime, I think I might scream because often the kids don't want to be on FaceTime or Zoom. Can you speak to that, please?
Yeah, so the only people that are allowed to say, well, at least you have FaceTime are other long distance grandparents. First of all, let's make that clear. No one else is allowed to say that. I have a blog post, I think, about the things that you're not allowed to say to long distance grandparents, and that is one of them. And so I definitely, if you go back to the presentation that I did before, I shared tons of ways to kind of address video chat. Terry, can you just say that again, the main question at the end? I got myself distracted.
The question is, if the kids don't want to be on Zoom and FaceTime, how do you stay in touch?
Yeah, so there will be times that kids feel like screen time, and don't want to come on. First of all, I don't know how old these children are, but like setting your expectations, think about like 1 minute per year of life. And it doesn't sound like long. You don't need to have, a very long phone or video chat conversation. In fact, kids, their attention spans are so short, you can't expect that on a video chat. You can try doing things like coming to the call ready to play. I don't know what you've tried so far, but it's not come and talk to Nana, right? It's like you're not coming to talk to Nana or chat with Nana. Like 5-year-olds don't want to necessarily chat, um, but they want to play. Do you want to play a game with Nana? And then you have something ready to play. And I have lots of ideas on my website. The other thing that you can do, lean on the mailbox, lean on sending mail if you can, because that's a touch point. Like that's another way and another connection moment with your grandchild, right? That fun piece of mail, like this is from Nana. That's something that you will be known for. And then the third thing that you can do is just send a really short, fun video message. So it could just be like you out in your garden, you find a frog, like getting right in there with your phone, sending them a video of, said frog, and then asking them like, what should we name this frog? Give them maybe a reason to send you a video back as an example.
Thank you. We have to sign off.
There's so many questions and comments and, I I want to say that, I'm happy to share whatever resources that I have available. Go to my website, take a look. There might be something there. I see some of you talking about talking about things like FaceTime, not being able to get the parents to engage, and like one of the things, just what I will say about this is that this is this is a long-term game. And, I know it's difficult because time is experienced differently as we get older. And so you're experiencing time very differently than your adult children are experiencing time. It really does move differently. Um, but over time, with consistent connection, you can start to see some of these things coming back to you. And so sending it out there, sending the mail, the letters, it does not have to be big, expensive parcels. It can just be fun looking mail, inviting them to a FaceTime chat, to talk about something specific. Go back to the presentation that I did before for Jewish Grandparents Network, because I really did share a lot of ideas about how, how to engage your grandchildren through snail mail, through video chat, because that's the sadness in a lot of this is that you have to show up in a different way. You have to show up virtually, you have to show up in a mailbox, and you have to kind of take a leap of faith that it's getting there. But I have watched grandparents time and time again see over time that it is getting there, right? That their grandchildren are soaking it in, and there is you cannot, damage a child by letting them know that someone else in this world loves them over and over again and being their grand cheerleader.
So I'm going to sign off and quote from chat. Our JGN's co-founder Lee Hendler said, "Thank you for your compassion, your wisdom, and your expertise." And that about says it, Kerry. Thank you very, very much for your sensitivity and for your understanding and all your good work. To our friends, thank you so much for joining us tonight, for sharing your time with us, and we hope you found Kerry's guidance helpful. We will be in touch with you tomorrow. So to all of you, thank you again, and we wish you a really good night.